And now it's time for our final speaker of today. And the introduction will be very short. Mr. Sten Nilsson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, hello boys and girls. I think it's 7-8 years ago since I spoke in this room last time, and I have vivid memories from it. It was about the Russian force sector, and it was organized by Minister of Foreign Affairs and SLU, I suppose, in combination. And the Russian minister was speaking about how he saw the future development of the sector. And I came after him, and I described what it really was. And he was sitting here, and he jumped up and shook me on the podium. So I can write in my CV, shocked by the Russian minister. So let's see who is jumping up today. I'm giving about 40 to 45 talks per year, and there is a disease among organizers. So you are discussing what you would like to include in your presentation, or what they want to hear, and suddenly your mailbox is filled up. You're saying, please, can you take that and that and that and that? And of course, as a good civil servant, you're doing that. And then they're coming back saying, no, you can only have 1/3 of that. I'm not saying, of course, that happened this time, but in fact, my presentation on the website will be somewhat longer, and it will be with references, so you can go there instead of keeping this presentation, which you will see on the screen. We need, of course, some kind of evaluation of the landscapes in order to make the decisions, to set priorities. But before I'm going into that, I will connect back to where Björn started, about the food security, that is one of the driving forces. And this is the latest map, which was released a couple of weeks ago, of the cropland of today. And if you're looking at earlier assessments of the cropland, there is a difference of about 45%. So it's very difficult to come up with solid policies and decisions. And if you're looking at the agricultural land, the uncertainty is even bigger. But this new JASA-IPFRI assessment of cropland, with the map we saw earlier, they have used a wiki platform and fused in data from the regular level into global data sets. And it looks like the uncertainty is reduced to about half in comparison to what we had earlier. But what's also coming out is that there is less land available for expansion on agriculture and for bioenergy. And if you can't fill up with bioenergy, they will invade the existing agricultural land. So we have to produce more from even less. We have also heard about the 10 principles by Jeff Sayers. I would like to point out that the 10 principles are only part of a total process. We have establishment of a stakeholder platform, we have establishment of planning capacity and implementation incentives, and shifting the land use among actors. And I think Jeff's principles are mainly on the last box. We have heard from the earlier speakers that the landscape is complex. And it is. We are dealing with geology, landforms, climate, vegetation, hydrology, land use, institutions, people, space and functions. And they are generating social, environmental, and economic output. And all of that has to be linked to policies at the national and international level. And this is, of course, making it complicated to come up with economic valuations. And I will try to illustrate why. First, I would like to make a difference between the separation between evaluation, and that is where you are rating the quality of the landscapes. And valuation is that when you're assigning an economic value to the landscape. We have had a long period of development where we are trying to develop methods for evaluation and valuation of landscapes. But very little consensus have come out, and why a certain landscape would be rated as better than another one. And those attempts do not provide sufficient information for decision makers. So the landscape research is today lacking quantitative tools for any relevant value assessment. And there are a lot of non-use values in the landscape values. And it's questionable if there is any economic procedure which can really measure non-use values. And if you're looking at the economic function of landscapes, they are interested on flow of services, flow on products, and flow of cash. If you're looking at the ecological and social functions, they are mainly interested in stocks, functions, and qualities. So it's different. So we have different dimensions of values, scales, and time horizons. And we don't have a methodology to connect these into one unit. Of course, quantification of cost is normally always easier than the quantification of values. So maybe instead of looking into economic and ecological criterion, we should probably use what the landscape contributes to the societal goals and objectives. There are 500 case studies carried out, and it's done mainly by different consultant companies. The references are in the fatter version, which will be on the web. But there were only 87 of those in Africa and 104 in Latin America, where you could look into some kind of valuation. Which is telling me that if the documentation, and that is going back to what Liz said, is so bad that you can't identify what's really going on, you can really question how sustainable those landscapes are. They will probably not survive very long. And in these cases, it's only possible to identify if there have been investments or not, and that there are certain outcomes coming out, but not the magnitude of it. And the changes are not compared to any baselines. But as Liz illustrated, the stakeholders are positive, but there are positive impacts of the landscape. You said that 87% of your papers you studied had a positive view. but we can't quantify it. So it remains to be demonstrated that the integrated landscapes outweigh the transaction costs, and whether the magnitude of the benefits is really greater than single sector strategies. So that work remains to be seen. And the desired human and social institutional outcomes take a very long time. And I think Liz said we have to look at the effects 5-10 years down the road in order to see that. And I would say probably 10. And that is underpinning the need of long-term support and funding. So what I said earlier is that maybe we should look into the societal development goals and on the cost side. This is not a ready concept, but it can be seen as something we can build on. And its Resources for the Future have done for Latin America, or they are working on it, to come up with the environmental services values and the cost for them. So what we can do is to further develop that system, to plug in saying what objectives do we want to have in order to reach the societal goals. And we can see what it will cost us and where those actions should take place. Another example is Starbucks. Starbucks is very nervous about the supply of coffee beans due to climate change. And of course, they started to go into the landscape from a supply point of view. But they have been broadening it, so they are looking into the social aspects. They are looking into the planetary aspects, and of course they're looking into the products. And I will not go through the criteria they are looking into, you can see it yourself. And they are, in the assessment made 2012, we can see that they are achieving things on certain criteria, both on the social level, environmental level, and the economic side. So that is a different concept in dealing with it instead of pure economic calculations. We have different types of integrated landscapes. We have can be led by the national government or multilateral donors, but it can also be a sub-regional initiative. It can be a traditional local community-led, it can be NGO-led, and it can be private sector-led. And those have different approaches. And therefore, the 10 Jeff Sayers principles are probably different depending on what type we are going into. So if you're looking at how the investments are happening today, in Latin America case studies, 87% of investments made by donors and NGOs, and in Africa, 95%. And that will not generate sustainable landscapes in the long term, because that is short-term funding. And government and NGOs are largely sector siloed in funding. So we have value investors, they are out of supply of products. We have social investors, we have conservation investors, but we have hardly any landscape investor. What we are seeing is that the industry is coming in. I spoke about Starbucks earlier, but there are others. Unilever, Nestle, Cargill, Mars, Tesco, Saab Miller, etc. They are investing in landscapes. Of course, they started from a supply chain point of view, but they have now adapted the big landscape concept with both the social, the environmental, and the supply issues. And there are a number of incentives for business to work at the landscape level. Of course, there is the issue of securing supply, but it's also a reputational issue, and it is cost saving, it is market opportunities, and it can mobilize resources. So there are a number of reasons for the industry, the big international industry in agriculture, to go into this, if you're speaking about agriculture. There are, of course, investment barriers, and they are very similar to what Liz said earlier about barriers for setting up landscapes. We lack benefits and value assessments. And it's so that the investment risks are substantially high compared to the very low return potential they have today. Investments in landscapes are piecemeal, which means that they are too small for existing conventional financial institutions. They want to deal with big things and not things like that. We have insecure tenure, customary rights, institutional settings, technical capacities, competencies, data, models, lack of business capacity, lack of value change. But there are also conflicting goals of investors and right holders. And there is an isolation of the stakeholders from consumers and markets, and financial and business providers and policymakers. And what we are seeing, the experiences from the industrial cases I have been into, is that there are conflicting legislation and rules which the government is not dealing with. So the industry can drive it to a certain step, but they can't go beyond that because the government is not backing it up. So investments tomorrow, we have to develop what I call business cases. And that is where we are demonstrating the benefits in a solid way of the landscape approach. We have to ensure feasibility in the institutional frameworks. We have to promote co-investments between industry, governments, and others. And we have to foster the multi-sector linkages. I think Anders didn't like it, but I think it's necessary to have payment for ecosystem services as an incentive. Without any incentive, you will not get the landscape. And we have to reduce the risks in investments. I'm coming to the upscaling issue, because if we really want to make an influence at the global scale, we have to deal at a larger scale. And if you're looking at, and this is again the JASA IFPRI map, the red is very small holdings, 1 hectare or less. and how the heck to get these together to a landscape concept. There is another illustration, and this is the deforestation in Amazonas, where we can see that the smallholders less than 25 hectares had about 25% of the deforestation in the beginning of 2000. Today, those are up to 55%. So this is a target we have to deal with. In order to upscale this, we have to deal with these guys. And to get the upscaling, again, I am back to the need of having case studies demonstrating the benefits of landscapes for policymakers and funders. And we need the economic incentive schemes. We need the establishment of efficient PES systems. We have to build capacities, establish links between landscapes and policy at a higher order scale. Because a lot of these things will not happen without you changing regional or national policies. And governments and industry must play a stronger role. And I think the governments are the bottleneck today. So the way forward, we need powerful and long-term actors, and that means governments and industry. Economic incentives is a must, and we have to establish new and better institutions and better capacity building. Again, develop a number of well-documented business cases. And I wonder if CEDAR couldn't play a role here to make this happen. And I think it's important to start from the development dimension and not from the market dimension. And that means that the landscape concept has to be implemented with a broader societal reform framework linked to policy issues at a higher scale. And to get scale of the area of landscape concepts, I think it's important to have disruptive changes of societal frameworks. And I think I finished there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We heard about the importance of upscaling and on focusing on the smallholders and also involving the private sector in this development if we should be successful with the landscape approach. Sten will not join us he will be here, but he will not be part of the panel discussion later on, so please ask your questions now. Let's start over here in the middle, and please present yourself with your name and your affiliation. Thank you.
Sure. Hi Sten, my name is Johan and I come from Tetra Pak, so I'm part of the industry that you're talking about, perhaps. I very much agree with your points. Very interesting presentation, and the reasons why industry get involved in the questions of sustainable development, working with risk mitigation and reputational risk and other factors, of course, as well as sort of ensuring that there is resources also for the industry to use in production, for example, trees, let's say, there's a renewable resource. I was wondering then how to sort of combine it here with the landscape approach, because I see what we're hearing here today is that it's a very complex topic, and for the industry, of course, we usually look at, I mean, if I talk from the industry point of view, it has to be quite clear and measurable, so it can be implemented easily into an organization. And I mean, for Tetra Pak's point of view, we worked a lot in our supply chains with certification of commodities, for example, FSC or other sort of certification systems. Do you see something similar trend happening in the landscape? Could it be certification of landscapes, or how do you think this could be integrated into sort of the industry?
No,
Sorry, it's a bit long question maybe.
yeah. No, I think certification is a complicated issue with respect to landscapes. So I think it's difficult to handle. But I mean, if companies like Cargill, Nestle, etc., have been able to move into working with a solid landscape concept, I don't see why, for example, the forest industry like Tetra Pak can't do the same. It is complicated. You have to put your will and your brain into it, but you can do it, for sure.
Could you please explain why you believe that the certification schemes are very complicated on the landscape scale?
No, but there are so many factors you have to take into account, and you have to deal with all of that. And that is, of course, what the industry is afraid of, to get stuck in all of these kind of interactions and not getting out of it. But the experiences I have seen with the case studies of the industry, where they have had, if they are doing it the right way, trying to build up trust with the local population, building up trust with the regions, where they are running into problems is that the legal framework is not consistent, and they have difficulties to move the national government.
I think you're right. I mean, of course, building trust with local communities is a very important part. But if you look on, for example, in our role in this Tetra Pak, we are not sort of directly working in the forest. We rely on other sort of forest companies to sort of supply us with the raw material we use in our production chain.
Yeah,
so
you're delegating responsibility.
Exactly, we are sort of further down in the supply chain.
Right.
So how then can a company work, further down the supply chain towards the goals that are sort of required on the ground, if not through some kind of sort of measurement tool or some kind of indication that this material has been produced in a certain way or another, if you don't have any, because legality is one thing, but then again, many of these countries where forestry or deforestation are kind of corrupt and the legal system is not very strong. So how do you work around that?
No, I think you have to be out there and making your assessments. Is this really sustainable, and is it really helping the local society to develop? But I think it's too complicated with a certification. I can see that you would like to have a certification, and you can flag with that when you're putting in the pulp into your box boards. But I think you have to be prepared to invest more than that.
We have another question down here in the first row.
Well, it's actually a comment.
Comment.
My name is Ola Möller. I work at SIDA. And I wanted to comment and follow up on your challenge here and the discussions you've had here. Before joining SIDA, I'm the Senior Policy Specialist for Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries and Food Security at SIDA. But before taking up this position in January, I worked for the unit within SIDA where we work with private sector actors. And what you're pointing out here is very valid. And we have since a couple of years back started trying not only to work with market development and sort of working with governments to make them develop rules, regulation, taxation and so on that would promote markets, but also work with the actors of the private sector, which I think is very important, and especially when it comes to these poorer countries. I think one very interesting initiative we have taken within SIDA is to invite the main Swedish companies, the main Swedish big global companies like IKEA, Hennes & Mauritz, De Laval, Tetra Pak, and many other Swedish companies. Actually, all the companies that have joined this initiative accounts for about 50% of the Swedish BNI. And we have formed the initiative called Swedish Leadership for Sustainable Development. And the common goal for this is to not only say that, okay, we have sort of secured our production, we know what our companies are doing in these countries, but we also want to make sure that the ones delivering to us, that those are also following the rules and regulations which are in conformity with our social, economic, environmental values and so on. We have only started working with this. Focus has so far been on the mechanical industry and textile industry, but I think it's a very interesting work we are doing. There are not so much results yet, but what we have found is that there is a big gap between understanding on the way things work between the private sector actors, donors, governments and so on. There is a huge gap of confidence building needed. And I think by just sitting down, talking about this, realizing that we share a common sweet spot where we have similar interests. For them, for the country, for the companies, they want to make money, which is fair, but they also want to have predictability, which can be established by poverty reduction, more secure and sustainable way of managing these natural resources. And I think it's not that difficult to find this common ground. It's a matter of sitting down.
I think what you see here is excellent, because this is a part of the panel discussion, and they are really eager to start a discussion. So I will ask Ola to join us later and talk more about this, and I think it's excellent. But now I would like Sten to make a comment upon this. Please, do you have any comments regarding, or do you agree,
No,
or do you think
we
it's
are
right?
on the same avenue, so it's fine.
Very good.
So I hope we can make a deal with SIDA.
Yeah, that's good. Sounds good.
Hello, my name is Lotta Samuelsson. I work for the Stockholm International Water Institute. I found your presentation really interesting, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on, you said that there are some larger companies which are already investing in landscapes. How are they doing that compared to them not being with certification? How are they doing that? And what are the drivers?
They are investing both, of course, their primary interest is to secure the supply. So investments are going to that, but they are also realizing they will not get that supply unless they are environmentally solid, and that they are also supporting the social development. So they are making investments in those two, and they are dealing with the trade-offs between these three. And I can't give you examples of how much money they are putting in each of these boxes, but they are investing in all of those three boxes.
So would that mean working both with sustainable production and also with the societies getting involved in the market, so to say?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
2 more questions. We have one in the back row. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Sten, for the nice, interesting presentation. I think I couldn't agree with you more on this integration of policy issues into the landscape approach. That is really very important. There are so many things happening outside whatever size of the landscape you are choosing, in terms of globalization, markets, climate, other things that you need to have the policy issue integrated. You mentioned something about smallholders there, that in the last part of your presentation, that much of the deforestation, or a big chunk of the deforestation, occurs for very small households. I'm a little bit uncertain about that. I've been working with landscape approaches in some countries with a lot of smallholders, like Vietnam and Ethiopia and so on. And I'm not sure how to move from this smallholder society towards broader holdings, so to speak, bigger holdings, because I'm not quite convinced they possess a lot of the deforestation, but also a lot of the reforestation. So the reverse process also takes place among those smallholders. So that there is a lot of power in the smallholders, and I'm not sure that it's so easy to just, if you want to move in that direction, you need to do it through policies that makes things happen in an organized way. Otherwise, you will end up, I think, with a lot of issues related to poverty.
Would you like
things.
Sten to make a comment upon this?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Yeah, you are of course right, and I'm not arguing that I have the answer on that. I was just flagging that this is an issue we have to deal with if we would like to see landscapes on a broad scale and making impact on the planetary aspects.
And then we have a final...
No,
okay,
I haven't answered him yet.
Okay. I'm sorry for this. Please.
But and you're completely right, and I think it's going back to that you must have incentives for these small holders to get to work with a bigger picture. And what those incentives are, they are probably different from region to region, and different in different countries. But without incentives, I think it's very difficult to move. Now, I'm fair.
Thank you so much for this, and we're very happy that Sten has joined us to prepare and organize this seminar, as he's a member of the advisory board of SIFI. Now it's time for the panel, and of course, big thank you, very interesting speech. Very good.